Welcome once again to the upper room. As always, love being with you, love coming to you in your living room, wherever you are watching this. And a very special lesson today as we're back in Western Colorado, and we'll tell you more about our setting in a moment. Jackie Cooper was a very famous child actor way back in the last century, and by the 50s and 60s he became an adult actor and then a director and producer. As a child actor, he was so famous that they kind of likened him to Shirley Temple. Now you got the right era, right? That's kind of the era in which he grew up and became very famous. So he was a director, an actor, a director, a producer. When he got bored with that, he became a race car driver. He also worked with thoroughbreds, raced thoroughbreds, and oh yes, he was a naval captain during World War II. So Jackie Cooper was one famous guy. He was so talented and so well known and had everything going for him. And then he lived out his life and did a great job with pretty much everything he did, as far as I can tell. And then in 2011, he finally passed away. So I want to read to you from a New York Times obituary about Jackie's life from May 4th, 2011. Jackie Cooper never knew his father. His dad cut out on the family in 1924 when Jackie was just 2 years old. In 1951, Cooper was driving his car from New York to LA. Apparently, at that point in his life, he didn't like flying and chose to make the cross-country trip in his car. He pulled into a service station one afternoon in some small town outside of Kansas City to get some gas and a Coke. As he was pumping gas, the mechanic recognized him and came over to greet him. Jackie shook his hand and was stunned to hear the man tell him that his father, Jackie's father, John Cooper Sr., lived upstairs over the garage. Cooper had to be in shock. The man went on to say that his father had Jackie's pictures all over his room and spoke of him with pride. And then he said this, "Let me go tell him that you're here." "Please don't," replied Cooper. "I don't need to be confused." And as the story goes, he then got in his car and drove away. Wow. Can you imagine? But that is the perfect intro into what we are talking about. We're talking, again, if you haven't been with us, we're in the Habits of the Heart series. We're on the Wall of Identity, and boy, does that describe identity in today's world. I know that was a century ago, or almost a century ago, but it was still true then that people's identity could become very confusing, and for a myriad of reasons. And in Jackie Cooper's life, it was because his dad wanted nothing to do with him his entire life, but from a distance adored him. And the idea of meeting him for Jackie Cooper seemed confusing. Like, I don't need more confusion when it comes to who I am and how I got where I am today. So welcome to this Wall of Identity as we again explore why it's so confusing and what clarity can possibly come when it comes to our identity. In high school, I might have mentioned this before, we read Ray Bradbury's The Illustrated Man. If you've never read that, it's really an interesting idea. What it is that Ray Bradbury writes about a man who had tattoos from head to toe that covered every inch of his body, but that every tattoo represented a different story. And so it was a compilation of different stories is what it was. And I thought about that. I've thought a lot about that since I was in high school. And at the time, tattoos really were pretty much limited to, sailors and, people in the service and that kind of thing. And now I would never have guessed that once in a while when I go to Walmart, I see the illustrated man or the illustrated woman. Tattoos have become a big deal, as you know, and I'm not here to weigh in on whether you should or shouldn't have tattoos. It's each for his own or her own to decide, of course. And I again side with Sebastian Maniscalco, the famous comedian, when he talks about why he doesn't have tattoos, and he simply says, "Why would I ever put a bumper sticker on a Ferrari?" So that's kind of where I stand, but we all have different takes on it. Today we're going to talk about tattoos. Kind of. Tattoos are the branding of a skin, but we're really going to talk about the branding of our hearts, right? Habits of the heart, and our identity is what's been branded on our hearts and then becomes how we see ourselves and life. And that's where we're going today. And that brings us to our location. We are so fortunate to be on some very dear friends' property, the Distals, who happen to be a part of our house church. And they have ranched for years and years and years. And they are so gracious to let us come here to where they have always branded their cows. And you can see behind me something they call, you know of corrals, but unless you've been around ranching, you may not be aware of what is right behind me. And that is what they call the squeeze chute. I once had the opportunity, not far from here, to watch and take part in some branding of some cattle. And the squeeze chute is essential. I would say the squeeze chute is second only to the actual branding tools that are used in the squeeze chute. Now, what is the squeeze chute, you may ask? It's where they bring and funnel the cows into an area where it's so tight the cows can't get away, because what's about to happen to them is going to be unpleasant, as you can imagine. It's a tattoo, but I would think it hurts even more than a regular tattoo. They get them in that chute, and then there's a handle. I don't know if you can see it, and they actually squeeze them down so they really can't move, so then they could be branded. And they scream and they hate it, but you gotta know, that sounds like abuse. Going back hundreds of years, ranchers and cowboys know that there has to be a brand. There has to be a mark on your cattle, or someone will steal them and you'll never find them again and never be able to prove that's your mark. So that becomes the identity, literally, of the cows when they're branded. And so that's what we're talking about, being branded for life. And you may not realize this, but there is some scripture that helps us understand this concept. So I'm going to ask you to turn to Galatians chapter 6. Paul writes to the church in Galatia, and in verse 14 it begins this way. As for me, Paul writes, may I never boast about anything except the cross of our Lord Jesus Christ. What is he talking about? Identity. What do we boast about? We boast about who I am, what I do, what I've accomplished, right? And that becomes our identity. And Paul is saying, I will not boast about anything because my identity now is connected to the cross of Christ. So if Paul had a tattoo, which I don't believe he did, if he had a tattoo, it would have been the cross, probably. The cross of Christ is where he identified himself now. He goes on, because of that cross, or that phrase can actually be also understood because of him, because of Jesus, my interest in this world has been crucified. What a great line. I am no longer interested at all in what the world cares about. That has died. And, he goes on, the world's interest in me has also died. Because my interest is not in what they do, they're not that interested in what I do. Isn't that practical? Doesn't it just make total sense? And yet, very few of us find ourselves in that particular place. Because of our identity, I really don't care about the maneuverings of the world and how they manipulate people and what they do. What I care about is the cross of Christ, and therefore they don't care that much about me. He goes on in verse 15. It doesn't matter whether we have been circumcised or not. So that's been the argument here. There's been an argument in the church in Galatia about whether the new Gentile believers should be circumcised. Again, I would have said, let's change it to a signet ring or a secret handshake. But that was the big controversy. And Paul is saying, I'm telling you, it doesn't matter. Well, what is circumcision? It is the cutting of the flesh of a man. It is a painful branding is really what it is. And so he goes into that metaphor. Watch this. He again says it doesn't matter whether we've been circumcised or not. What counts is whether we have been transformed into a new creation. That takes us back to the last lesson, 2 Corinthians 5:17. You are a new creature in Christ. The old is gone, the new has come. A new life. Quit living in the past. You are a brand new person. He goes, that's what matters. So we've been transformed. We've been changed, and we've been changed from the inside out. It's not just an outward marking that identifies us. Now he goes on, may God's peace and mercy be upon all who live by this principle. The principle that I am changed by Jesus from the inside out. That's going to be essential for what we're going to understand today about identity. They are the new people of God from now on. He's talking about the Gentiles, okay? Welcome them in. They're the new people of God from this point on. Don't let anyone trouble me with these things. He said, I'm done with it. I'm done with the conversation. We're moving on. And then he ends with this phrase. Watch what he says. For I bear on my body the scars that show I belong to Jesus. My heart has been transformed, and the tattoo I have, I'll tell you about the tattoo. It's the scars of stoning and being beaten and whipped, and the chains I've worn that have been left on my flesh. I didn't need to go through a squeeze like this. I've been through enough squeezes where I bear the marks of Jesus. He says, that's my identity. It starts in the heart. You can see it on my body. Now the word he uses there, I want you to notice it, for scars is the Greek word stigma. A stigma, all right? And it literally means something that implies ownership and suggests that these scars serve as brands. Isn't that a great word? It's a stigma that says, I am owned by somebody else, therefore I receive these scars. That is being branded in Jesus. Truly is what he's saying. Now there's another kind of branding that he'll go into in his letter to Timothy, 1 Timothy chapter 4 and verse 1. All right, this is a totally different context, and he's going to use a different word, but it has great similarities to it. Here we go. Verse 1. Now the Spirit explicitly says that in later times, some will desert the faith and occupy, or be occupied by, themselves with deceiving spirits and demonic teachings. We've talked about that, right? The teachings that go on that do not align with Jesus are demonic. We need to, again, come to grips with that. He says, in the later days, we will occupy ourselves and with the teachings of demonic ideas. And then he says this, and influenced by the hypocrisy of liars. Talked a lot about that. Our culture is filled with liars. Every time they open their mouth, the media, the government, it's lies, right? And with liars whose consciences are seared. That's the word. The first word we looked at back in Galatians was stigmata, right? Scars. And the word seared in some translations is actually, you guessed it, branded. It's the word kaustirazo. And what it means it can be the cause, which is the brand, or it can be the effect, which is the searing. So these liars' consciences and those who believe them have both been branded and seared, sealed, if you will, with an image, and that is we now belong to this culture. Do you see the incredible metaphors that Paul uses by using two different words that are so similar? One has to do with being branded by Jesus. One has to do with being branded by this culture. And it begs the question, which is true of us? Am I the one that carries the brand of the culture? My conscience has been seared. It's hardened to the truth of Christ. Or have I been branded by Jesus? My identity now is purely connected, tightly associated with Jesus himself. And so again, the idea of branding here in these two words, these two passages, has to do with identity, doesn't it? It has everything to do with our identity and what has been seared into us and what we portray to the world. And it's very clear that our identity will be associated with either Jesus or with this world. Now, if we have been branded by Jesus, and then we may bear the scars, as Paul talked about, now this branding results in something very special. Let me read to you from 1 John chapter 3, verse 1. John writes, "See what great love the Father has lavished on us." That word lavish is a beautiful word. It's the same picture as when the woman lavished her love and honor on Jesus when she broke her bottle, remember, that was worth a year's wages of perfume, and broke it and poured it all over him. She was lavishing praise on him. So it's the same concept that John's talking about. And John was probably there, maybe had that in mind when he writes this. So he says, Jesus has lavished his love on us, and the result is this: we shall be called children of God. That's our identity. The branding of our heart brings us to a place where we're called children of God. And that is what we are. The reason the world does not know us is that it did not know him. Dear friends, now we are children of God. That's our new identity. If you've been branded by Jesus, you are now a child of God. A little caveat here. They're going to have a couple caveats today. One caveat is this idea that everyone is a child of God in this world is not true. Everyone has been created by God. But only those of us who have been branded by Jesus and had his love poured out on us are children of God. You remember, Jesus actually turned to the Pharisees and talked about the devil, Satan, being their father. So they are children of the father of lies, is what he was saying about them. So that idea, which is malarkey, that everyone is a child of God, cannot be true. It is just reserved for those of us who have been branded by Jesus. But all of us can walk down that chute and be branded by Jesus. That's the great news. So with that in mind, now we look at kind of what's going on in our culture. And the culture is now just bold-faced lying about the fact that we can find our identity in hundreds of things. We can choose to identify ourselves as a cow if we want to, a kitten if we want to. That lie is so ridiculous. It's so unscientific and so unbiblical. It brings me to a fascinating quote by C.S. Lewis, where he said, one of the most cowardly things ordinary people like you and me, one of the most cowardly things ordinary people do is to shut their eyes to facts. Wow. That says it. If I will not acknowledge the fact that God created everyone to be either a man or a woman, I'm a coward. I'm a coward, and that's what's going on. All right? It's not about name calling, but it is cowardly to ignore truth about how God created all of us. With this background in mind, I don't know how many of you are fans of the great Western author Louis L'Amour, but he wrote over 100 novels and short stories. One of his short stories was actually entitled Ridin' for the Brand. And so we're going to kind of claim that little phrase, borrow it from Louis L'Amour, and talk about when we live for Jesus, we are riding for the brand of Jesus, all right? And that's one phrase we're going to latch onto, and then another one that we'll use in this lesson. By the way, we're going to break this lesson into two parts, because the first part, we just need to spend so much time on it. It's so significant. But the other phrase is a phrase that some attribute going back to JFK, just in the days before he was assassinated. I believe it goes actually back hundreds of years, and that is the phrase, you can finish it, it's so famous, for every man, woman, and, you got it, child, right? Whether it's the Titanic going down and every man, woman, and child needs to be saved, or it's JFK talking about communism and how it will come for every man, woman, and child. The point is this: we're going to use that phrase as our outline, and today we'll only talk about the man, all right? And the reason we're going to do that, spend so much time on it, is that's really the only place at this point in my life I have expertise. Not going to be a woman, never have been a woman, and I'm no longer a child. We will cover women and children as far as our identity, because God creates man, woman, and yes, children, which are either man or woman at the child state. Okay, so we're going to start with man, but we're going to use that phrase, every man, woman, and child, as kind of our outline as to identity. In Jesus, when we ride for the brand, what does it look like as a man? What does it look like for a woman to ride for the brand of Jesus? What does it look like for a child to ride for the brand of Jesus? Which brings us to our first discussion question, and that is, what has it looked like for you to ride for the brand of Jesus? What are the outward signs of an inward change that took place? Have a great discussion. I'd love to have heard what you had to say about being branded by Jesus, what that appears, what it looks like as you live your life out for Him. And I don't know if you ever thought about that you ride for the brand of Jesus. Now, one more caveat before we get into this, the bulk of this lesson. And the caveat is this. I'm going to make an assumption, and I want to be real upfront about it, okay? And the assumption is this, that you are a follower of Jesus. You are one who is a student, a disciple of Jesus. And if you're not, then what I'm about to say may sound ludicrous. It may make no sense whatsoever, and that's okay, because I believe at some point you will decide to follow Jesus. But for the bulk of those of us who watch these lessons and take part in these house churches, to my knowledge, almost all that I know of are followers of Jesus. Now, we're at different places on that journey, but what that means is, as we just read in that passage, the world does not understand Jesus, so they certainly don't understand us, and the fact that we find our identity in Him and the effects that has in our life. So the things I'm going to say about the identity of a man and the identity of a woman and the identity of a child in regard to being branded by Jesus, riding for that brand, are going to sound crazy if you don't follow Jesus. All right? And you may have a problem with it. I get that. Just understand this part of this lesson is not really aimed at just anybody. It's for those of us who have chosen to follow Jesus, and a radical change has taken place in our lives. I mean, that's what it means to follow Jesus. A radical change takes place, especially in regard to how we see our lives and how we treat other people. Okay, with that caveat in mind, all right, I'm not trying to acquiesce or trying to make sense to the whole world about this. It'll be very narrow. It'll be like that chute. The cattle come down, they get pushed into it and then squeezed down. We're going to squeeze this down to what does God say about a man, okay? We're going to start with a man, like I said. In the next lesson, we'll get to women and children, all right? Each are equally important, valuable, precious in God's eyes. Now we begin with men. So men, you need to not run to the bathroom for the next 45 minutes. You need to stay here and face the music. All right, what does God say about riding for the brand of Jesus as a man? Some of you know these things, but it'll be a good refresher. First of all, man, as God sees him, as we identify with Jesus for men, we are the head. All right, what that means, we are the thermostat. We're not thermometers. We don't react to climate as men who identify with Jesus. We are the thermostat. We dictate the climate of a home or a business or a culture in which we live. That's what we do. We set that climate. We set the tone for the climate. And you know that in families where there is chaos and it's out of control, that the man has not set the climate, or maybe he has. Maybe he has set a climate of absolute chaos. So as the thermostat, as the climate calibrator, meaning the one who adjusts to make sure the climate is what it ought to be, as one who rides for the brand, what you need to know, we could go so deep into this, we could spend weeks and weeks on this, and many have, but we want to keep it to one lesson. There are 4 things we want to cover. I'll spend the bulk of our time on the first one. That is, that man is a loving man. He is a loving man, but that gets complicated because the world has twisted the meaning of love. So we'll talk in depth about that. He's also a leading man. He's also a man who provides and protects. So he loves, he leads, he provides and protects. All right, so let's jump into love. What does that mean? Where do we get that? Ephesians chapter 5, verse 25. For husbands, this means love your wives just as Christ loved the church. He gave up his life for her. So there is the mandate that a man loves his wife. It gets deeper and more complicated when it says, just as Christ loved the church, and then it gets clarified, And you can see that in how Jesus gave himself up for her. In that sense, he was sacrificial, unselfish. So let me give you 3 words that describe this kind of love. It is unselfish, unconditional, and unwavering. Got that? This kind of love, there are all kinds of loves out there. This kind of love, for those of us men who are branded right for the brand of Jesus, it is unselfish, unconditional, and unwavering. It's solid in what it does, in what we believe. Chapter 13 in 1 Corinthians is Paul's dissertation on love, if you will. And in verse 11, we find this. When I was a child, I talked like a child. I thought like a child. I reasoned like a child. Okay, that's why we're going to spend some time on a child who is identifying with Jesus. When I became a man, however, I put the ways of childhood behind me. What's he mean by that? Video games. I mean, that's just one example. Children play with video games. Unfortunately, children never grow up sometimes. They look like men, but they still play video games. That's just one example. Okay, the point being, it's time to grow up. It's time to have a grown-up love. The kind of love this culture presents to us and allows us to use, supposedly, is an adolescent love. It's very immature. Men who ride for the brand, men who are branded by Jesus, identify themselves with Jesus, have a love that is grown up. It is mature. And so what does that look like? In fact, is it possible that men no longer grow up? And you know the answer. Absolutely. And so obviously, if we're going to talk about the love of a man branded by Jesus, it assumes that we have grown up in our love. And I take you to 1 Corinthians chapter 16, verse 13. All right? 1 Corinthians 16, 13. I'm going to read it to you from 2 different translations, and there's a reason for that. And it's very fascinating, I think. In the NIV, it says, "Be on your guard, stand firm in the faith, be courageous, be strong." That sounds like manly talk, right? And that's what he's doing. Be on your guard, stand firm in the faith, be courageous, be strong. Verse 14, do everything in love. Everything. Everything has to be bathed in love. What kind of love? An adolescent love? No, because that's a selfish love. This is an unselfish love. Okay? So I read that to you in the NIV. Now there's an interesting thing that's happened. In the later translations, I would include the NIV, the NLT, others, that's pretty much how it reads. But if you go to earlier translations, there's something inserted in there that the translators have left out in recent years. And you'll hear it in the New American Standard Version, 1 Corinthians chapter 16, verse 13. Be on the alert, stand firm in the faith, act like men. Be strong, let all that you do be done in love. Act like men has been omitted. In fact, there might be a little asterisk in your Bible there in the middle of that verse, which will tell you at the bottom of the page, we left that part out. Now, why did they leave that part out? Discussion question. Why do you think in later translations that phrase, act like men, has been left out? Why do you think that's happened? And so the word that's right there in the Greek text that has been omitted is the word androzomai, and it means to conduct oneself in a specified way. You need to live in a very specific way, and literally that word is not found anywhere else in the Bible. It's a very unique and special word, and the modern translation of it might be man up. Man up. It's time you act like a man. There's actually another version that says play it like a man. And the point is this. There's a role. Okay, when I talk to you, Paul says about standing firm and be courageous, be firm in your faith, be strong. I'm saying it's time to be a man. It's time to love like a man, because that's how he ends it. In all things you love. How do we love as a man loves who has been branded by Jesus is the question. Why is this important? Because for sure the culture has no idea, right? And I'm sad to say that the church has little idea about what this looks like. Is it possible that the later translations have assumed that we no longer know what a man actually looks like? What a man actually lives like? It's become so distorted. Maybe that's why it's not in there, but the point is it's in there. It's originally in there, and it's important that it's in there. Christy was telling me this week that the CDC came out having approved a new drug for men who want to breastfeed. You knew it had to come, right? It had to come. The only difference is when they take this drug, evidently what comes out of their part of their body that would allow that to happen is not actually milk, of course, because only God would do that. It's actually a chemical that's poisonous. Shocker! Shocker that the government would actually want us to poison our kids. Yeah, that's the reality of the time in which we live, where supposed men, I think breastfeeding is a good idea. Let me try that for a while. Okay. I take you to Deuteronomy chapter 22, verse 5, a verse you probably haven't memorized, but maybe now you should. Here we go. A woman must not put on men's clothing, and a man must not wear women's clothing. Anyone who does this is detestable in the sight of the Lord your God. You really didn't need to know that was there, but it's nice to know that's there, right? Because your spidey sense has gone off saying, is this really good? Is this a good idea? No, we once had a preschool teacher, director, that was having boys wear girls' clothes, and she was so happy about it. You can bet that I didn't have encouraging words for her. The point is this was never God's idea. So there's such confusion about what being a man is all about. And that's why Paul says, man up. Let there be true love in all that you do. What is God's kind of love? We're going to get to that. But the demonic presence in our culture is seeping into the church, where the church is saying, that's okay. You know, it's all right for a man to wear those clothes and to breastfeed. It's time to go back to Scripture. And it's not unloving to go back to Scripture and go, what does God want? So you may be asking, how has this happened? It's pretty simple, actually. The two most important and most famous people in all the world of all time happen to be Adam and Jesus. In fact, in the New Testament, Paul actually calls Jesus the second Adam, as though there's Adam, the original, and Adam, the best, the perfect. And then he compares and contrasts the two. And God had given both Adams a work to do, a will to obey, and a woman to love. The first Adam failed miserably, as you know. I don't have to go back to that story, do I? Failed miserably. The second Adam did it perfectly. He did the work God gave him to do, the reconciliation of man. He obeyed the will of the Father, right, in the garden. I obey your will. And then he loved the woman, the bride, the church, perfectly. Okay, so what has happened? In our world and in the church today, most often, men are choosing to follow the first Adam. And that's a losing proposition, and Paul brings up in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 22, where he says, for as in Adam all die. If that's the path you want to take as a man, death is the result. He goes on, so in Christ, all will be made alive. There's your options. We can identify with the first Adam, which is what almost all men do, or we can identify with the second Adam, who is Jesus. What's the difference? The second Adam was responsible. He took the responsibility to do the work that God gave him, obey the will of the Father, and love the woman that God gave him, the church. He did it in the most responsible fashion you could. And then you have the first Adam, who was irresponsible and, in a word, passive. The first Adam's brand, if you will, is passivity. We know that when we go back to the Garden of Eden, we find Adam is there the whole time. But he's not there. That's like modern man, isn't it? That's like the man who follows Adam. We're physically here. We're just not here. We're just not really present in the things God has for us. Back in the 60s, a fascinating study was done by one John Calhoun, and you can even read about it today on the internet if you want to. And it's fascinating because he was wanting to study overpopulation. I guess that's back when overpopulation became a thing, a trend. Oh my, we're going to overpopulate the world. What do we do? And so he began a study. And it was with mice. It was kind of a mouse utopia, if you will. Remember, we've told you this. Utopia means, topia is place, and the U in front of it means not. Utopia is not a place. But he tried to have a mouse utopia, and he put several hundred mice together in this perfect environment. But he wanted to see if overcrowding would change things. The problem is, before there ever became overcrowding, things got kind of weird in this experiment. He thought he'd end up with, tens of thousands of mice. Actually, he only got up to about 620 mice. And then after 320 days, less than a year, things went south on his experiment. In the beginning, it was what they expected. The mice bred, they enjoyed each other, they bred more mice, they multiplied, it was going fine. But the essential part of this experiment was that they would give them everything they needed in this utopia. They would never have to look for food. All the food was given to them, never need to look for water. Everything, it was the perfect environment. They didn't have any predators they had to be worried about. They really didn't have to do anything. And so they grew and grew and got up to 620, but again, there was room for thousands. On day 315, everything changed. All of a sudden, they started noticing a change in the behavior of the mice. The male mice began to get aggressive and really violent with each other, killing one another, eating one another. The female mice kind of went off on their own. He called them the beautiful mice. Kind of like I think we can call some people the beautiful people. And they just, they literally just took care of themselves. They quit taking care of their babies. They walked away from them, and they just, looked in the mirror and did their hair and everything, I guess. But that's literally what he says happened. I mean, they just took care of themselves. They were the beautiful mice. And then the angry mice. And then amongst the male mice, there were some disinterested mice. They just became disinterested in everything, including breeding. Can you imagine? A man becoming not interested in breeding? And that's what happened. And eventually, get this, every single mouse died. Was it overcrowding? No, there was plenty of room. See, the point was to say, when there's overpopulation, things are going to get bad. But there was never overpopulation. The point was, that the point of the study became, even though they didn't even think this might happen, when you give everything to a creature, and they don't have to work for anything or do anything on their own, they become so complacent or so angry that it becomes dysfunctional, and they self-destruct. That's really what happened in this study by Calhoun. In fact, Calhoun had a phrase for it. He called it behavioral sink. Their behavior went in the toilet. Is what happened. Are you getting the connection? Doesn't that look like our culture today? I mean, the violence, the outrage by people who have everything they'd ever want. Most of the Antifa people who are burning things down and doing the rioting are actually coming from wealthy families. They have everything they want. But for some reason they're angry, right? Races against races. We really have in this culture everything we could ever want, and we're self-destructing. Isn't that interesting? That we live like mice. Now you as a man may say, that's not me. I don't become complacent. I'm not passive like Adam. Not at all. I'm a risk taker. And yes, you may be a risk taker. Typically, most men versus women are risk takers. My question is not, are you a risk taker? My question for you is, why are you a risk taker? For the most part, we as men take risks because it feeds us. It feeds our ego, right? It's a self-centered thing that we do. It's for me that I do this, and I want people to see. You get on YouTube and you see all kinds of things people do to be seen, to get likes and views, right? Very seldom anymore do men take risks on the behalf of others. You see, that's a risk that is worth taking. If you and I are willing as men to take risks on behalf of others, then that's a fine risk to take. Otherwise, honestly, men, I'm talking to the men here, women may like what they see in you before you get married, all the risk taking you do because they assume you'll take those risks to protect them. The reality is when they see you continue to take risks, but it's for yourself, they actually think it's kind of stupid. On the other hand, there was an Instagram post in 2020 that got so many hits. This Instagram post got millions of hits, and it was simply a picture of a young boy and an even younger girl together. And when you look closer, at first you thought, oh, they're cute. When you look closer, the boy was just, his face was disfigured, had scars, and it was swollen and bruised. He looked terrible. And so when you read the story and the father filled in the details of the story, what had happened is a German shepherd had gone after, the little girl was his little sister, 4 years old, had gone after her, and he stepped in and took on the German shepherd. And here's what he told his dad when he was in the hospital. He said, "I thought if someone should have to die, it should be me." 6 years old. I pray that little Bridger, young Bridger, never unlearns that. The risk is well worth it if it's on the behalf of others. The problem is, because that's how God created us as men, to take risks, but it's in protecting the vulnerable, the downtrodden. But what we have done, as most of us as men, is we decide to take risks for ourselves. It's a purely selfish endeavor. And in doing that, we side with Adam. Adam was passive, so we become passive in things that matter, and in things that don't matter, we take great risks. Here's my evidence. Men commit 90% of major crimes. They commit 100% of rapes. They commit 95% of burglaries. They commit 91% of offenses against the family. And they comprise 94% of drunk driving incidents. That is, we are the problem. What's ironic is God created us to be the answer, not the problem. He created us as men to be the ones who take the pressure off those around us, who stand up for the downtrodden and vulnerable. And yet, because of our selfishness, men, we have become the problem in families, in the church, and in the culture. So in the garden, when the serpent struck, Adam was there, but he wasn't there. He was absent in every way that truly mattered. Here's my point. Sin is not just the activities that God hates and has on a list of things not to do. Sin is what keeps me from being who God created me to be. And that's the big problem. Sin keeps me from living out the branding of Jesus on my life. My identity being that I ride for the brand of Jesus, and I love in a way that the world knows not of. We've talked in the past about Jeffrey Dahmer. Jeffrey Dahmer was convicted of murdering 17 people, murdering, dismembering, and it went worse than that, as many of you know, in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And so he was given 957 years in prison for this. It was just 2 years later that he was murdered by another inmate who found him deplorable. The story was that he came to Christ before he was murdered, but we'll only know that when we pass over to the other side and see if Jeffrey is there. Something interesting happened, though, after he died, and that is that there was a cry to take his brain and study it. What kind of a person murders and dismembers and consumes 17 human beings? The mom said she was all for it. There was controversy because she wanted, study my son's brain. There had to have been something, a wire crossed in his brain. The father, a guy named Lionel Dahmer, did not want it studied because he already knew the answer. And he wrote a book later called A Father's Story, and I want to read a little part of that book. He wrote this: "And so I wasn't there to see him, Jeffrey, as he began to sink into himself." Behavioral sink, remember that? "I wasn't there to sense, even if I could have sensed, that he might be drifting toward that unimaginable realm of fantasy and isolation that it would take nearly 30 years to recognize." Fantasy and isolation. Passivity and living in a fake world is what men typically do. Now, we don't all end up like Jeffrey Dahmer, but in our hearts, do we not drift in that direction if we do not ride for the brand of Jesus, who calls us to a radically different kind of love? In Brent Hanson's book, The Men We Need, he says this: people don't buy movie tickets to watch men without a mission. There is no whatever man hero in Marvel Universe. Passive man is a disappointment at best and a threat at worst. That says it, doesn't it? When we become passive, and literally most men I know are passive, we are either a non-factor or we can become an actual threat. And this is an experiment our society has undergone now for many decades. There is a sociologist by the name of David Blankenhorn, and he said this experiment is one of the most daring and untested design. Fatherlessness represents radical departure from virtually all of human history and experience. Okay, so what is so different about the love that those of us who ride for the brand have? It is unselfish, it's uncompromising, it's unconditional, it's unwavering, but it is about others, because that's what Jesus showed us. So there's that kind of love, and then there's the kind of leading that he has called us to as the thermostat of any surroundings we have. And the kind of leading is the kind of leading that Jesus led with. If we sign up to ride for the brand of Jesus, we will learn to lead like Jesus, who said in Matthew 20:28 and Mark 10:45, I have not come to be served, but to serve and to give my life as a ransom for many. That's the kind of love and that's the kind of leading I will do. I will lead by serving. And you know, I won't read it to you, that in John 13, it says that now he loved his disciples at the beginning of the upper room scene. He loved them to the end, to the full extent. And how did he do it? He did it both by grabbing a towel and water and serving them, and by dying for them and for us. That's what leading as a man, not the first Adam, as the real man, Jesus, led. So we're to love as Jesus loved, unselfishly, lead as Jesus led, as a servant. And that serving nature helps us bring safety and security to our family. You know what women are attracted to? Study after study show safety and security. Now they might believe that those big biceps will help with safety and security, but later on they get married and find out it didn't help. I don't feel safe. I don't feel secure. In fact, those big biceps are a threat to me, actually. And so it is loving as God would have us love as men, leading as God would have us lead as men. It is providing as God would have us provide. And again, that's food, water, shelter, clothing, all those things. But more importantly, it is safety and security, what women and children need most. Sociologist Alan Bloom put it this way: fathers have lost the idea that the highest aspiration they might have for their children is for them to be wise, as priests, prophets, or philosophers are wise. Specialized competence and successes are all they can imagine. Did you get that? Fathers now are a place where all they want from their children is to be really great at something, instead of for them to be wise in the way they live. And so that is how we provide for our children, is to show them what wisdom is. And finally, protection. All right, we love as God shows us how to love. We lead, we provide, and finally, protection is a big part of what He's called us to be to those around us. Because why? Because God is our ultimate protection, and we learn that from Him. And yet one segment of our society, 75% of the men have left, abandoned the family, and no longer is there to protect. Those men are cowards. All right? They're not branded with the brand of Jesus. They don't ride for the brand, no matter what they say. But for us not to protect in every sense. And literally, we know about the idea that, well, when someone breaks into our house in the middle of the night, I've got my bat, or I got my sword, or I got my BB gun. We know about that, and we think, oh, that's protection. It goes much deeper than that, men. So I'm going to tell you, men, something you may not want to hear, but I got to be blunt about it. Men, you must shelter your children. You must shelter them. There's a phrase thrown around in this culture, and that is, oh, you can't shelter your kids. You know, you can't hide your kids from this. You must. If you don't, then you're not believing 1 Peter 5:8, where it says, the enemy prowls about like a roaring lion, seeking someone to devour. If you are paying attention to the craziness in the month of June, and the radical alphabet group They came out and said what they have always believed. They said it loud and proud. We are coming for your children. You would think they'd be put away for saying such a thing, because we know what they mean by that. But they're not. They're applauded, they're lauded, they're praised. Oh, yes, let them come for our children. Men, you must shelter your children. Because the goal of the world, the toxic world, the poisonous world in which we live, is to destroy your children. It is to devour them. I want to go back to a series of quotes, again, back in the book, The Men That We Need by Brent Hansen. Here's a few things he talks about in regard to this. You do not exist, men, to make your kids marketable to the corporate world. You are here to shape character as securely and fully as you can before they leave your home. And then for those who say, well, I'm going to send them off to be a missionary. I've heard that from a lot of friends. My kids need to be missionaries. Really? Because the missionaries I know have been trained, and they're later in life, and they've been taught how to deal with the culture they live in, and these kids have not. And he says this about them: childhood is their time to be protected and formed, not sent into battle. Why are we sending 4, 5-year-olds, 8, 9, 10-year-olds, 12-year-olds into battle unprepared, is what he says. And then in regard to the modern activity of technology in our culture, he says, show them the real world in time, in season, and informed by wisdom. And then he asked a counselor friend, really wanting to know, at what age should I give my child a smartphone? And his counselor's response was perfect, because people have asked us this. This is the perfect answer. His counselor said this: you give them a smartphone when you want their childhood to end. The minute you hand that to them, their childhood is over. As a protector, as a man who rides for the brand, you are to shelter your kids and train your kids, not send them to the wolves and say, well, I wonder what happened later on. Okay, the bottom line, let's get to it. The bottom line is most men I know, outside the church, inside the church, are still self-centered. We still have enormous egos. We think about ourselves and our desires and our wants more than anything else. And so we are not riding for the brand. We are not loving as Jesus would have us love, leading as Jesus would have us lead, providing as Jesus would have us provide, and protecting as Jesus would have us protect those under our care. We are not putting ourselves aside, men, because it's simply not practical. And yet, we cannot claim to identify with Jesus, to ride for his brand, if we're not going to put ourselves aside and put others before us. It is our job, men, is our role, as God has ordained it, to teach our family and those who are close to us how to learn from, live for and with, and lean into God himself. That does not happen by accident. We don't drift into that. That's something you do, I do on purpose. If you don't know how to do it, ask for some help. We'd be thrilled to come alongside you, but it must start happening, because we are losing families. The church, I believe, in the form it was supposed to be, has been lost. The culture is certainly lost, because we as men are not being who God called us to be. We are like the first Adam, not the second Adam. As you know, the Navy SEALs are quite a group of people, amazing in what they accomplish, what they do, and how they got where they are. I don't know if you realize that 20,000 naval recruits apply to be Navy SEALs, and only 1,000 of them will actually be accepted. And of the 1,000 that are accepted, 75% of them will wash out. So there was this article I came across, and it was, I believe, in the New York Times several years ago, and it was written by Eric Greitens, who was a Bronze Star and Purple Heart recipient and a Navy SEAL, and it was entitled The SEAL Sensibility. And I want to read it to you because it really brings this all to a close for us. Here's how it goes. The pinnacle of SEAL training is known as Hell Week, a period of continuous tests and drills during which most classes sleep only a total of 2 to 5 hours. What kind of man makes it through Hell Week? Well, that's hard to say, but I do know generally who won't make it. There are a dozen types that fail. The weightlifting meatheads who think that the size of their biceps is an indication of their strength. The kids covered in tattoos announcing to the world how tough they are. The preening leaders who don't want to get dirty. And the look at me former athletes who have always been told they were stars but never had been pushed beyond the envelope of their talent to the core of their character. In short, those who fail are the ones who focus on show. Wow, does that say it? I know a lot of men who focus on show, what I look like. He goes on, the vicious beauty of Hell Week is that you will either survive or fail, you'll endure it or you'll quit, you'll do it or you do not do it. Some men who seemed impossibly weak at the beginning of SEAL training, men who puked on runs and had trouble with pull-ups, made it. Some men who were skinny and short and whose teeth chattered just looking at the ocean also made it. Some men who were visibly afraid, sometimes to the point of shaking, made it as well. And he concludes this way. Almost all the men who survived possessed one common quality. Even in great pain, faced with the test of their lives, they had the ability to step outside of their own pain, put aside their own fear, and ask, how can I help the guy next to me? They had more than the fist of courage and physical strength. They also had a heart large enough to think about others, to dedicate themselves to a higher purpose. Did you catch that? Please don't miss that. The men who accomplish what very few can accomplish, the common trait is selflessness. How many men do you know who are truly selfless? That is a character trait that is there because you've been truly branded by Jesus. You ride for his brand, for it was his selflessness that brought him to this earth, that made him a servant amongst men and took him to the cross to take your sins and mine. The ultimate man, not the first Adam, the second Adam, he was selfless. Quit worrying, men, about the kind of car you drive, about how many animals you kill, how many fish you catch, how many mountains you climb, how many rivers you conquer. Start being concerned about becoming a selfless person, especially for those whom God has given under your care. For you are the thermostat. You set the climate. It is a difficult road. It is a challenging road. Being the head is not one of ego or show. It is something of real grit. We need men who will truly ride for the brand of Jesus. In Texas, they have a saying, big hat, no cattle. Is that you? Got a big hat. It's a big show I put on about being a man, all the things I accomplish, the great job, all the money in the bank. But it's no cattle, actually. I actually am not doing what riding for the brand demands. Thanks for joining us in this very cool setting. I will probably be back here for the next lesson because it's about now women and children. I can't wait to talk about the value and identity of women and children since it's so confusing these days. We'll either be back here or to another place just like this in the next lesson. Great to be with you. Men, was this tough? You got a man up. Love you.